3. I was doing well in my growing career, but not well enough to afford something like the house I shared with Jenna. Not yet, anyway. I had my own place, a 1,300 square foot bungalow in Judkins Park, a gentrifying neighborhood southeast of the city center. I'd paid cash for the place with the revenue generated by the surprising success of my book. I'd moved to Seattle ostensibly on the suggestion of Damon Childs, my boss of sorts, but I'd long imagined putting some distance between my family and me and living somewhere on the West Coast. Damon was the founder of Blackstone Capital, a tech-centric hedge fund, and I swallowed his lucrative invitation to serve as the company's performance coach. When I took Damon's offer, I bought my little house, built in 1909, and spent much of my time improving it. That's naturally where much of my time and energy gets directed, on improving things, and I very much enjoyed the adventure of my new life in the Emerald City. When I moved, I didn't know anyone in Seattle, though a friend from grad school grew up here and introduced me to a few good people. But for my first year in the city, I kept myself busy with work and household projects. I felt lonely, but when I did, I usually just went out somewhere by myself. I enjoyed my own company, and the diversity of this city and the surrounding landscapes provided plenty of potential adventures and opportunities to meet new people. Plus, I had enough money now that if I wanted to do something, a concert, a game, a long weekend skiing in Whistler, I just did it. I discovered that the great upside of not knowing anyone in a new place was just that. No one knew a thing about me. That wasn't the case back in Bakers Falls, New York. The Falls, as we call it, lays at the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains, an old rural mill town on the banks of the Hudson River, about 200 miles directly north of Manhattan and 20 miles from the border of Vermont to the east. Whenever I returned there, which grew rarer after my mother's death, I still felt seen through the lens of my family's past, rather than any of my own accomplishments since leaving town. Out west, the slate was blank, and I learned how entertaining shaping people's perceptions of me could be. When someone asked me that god-awful question of what I did for a living, I came up with several answers that depended on my feelings toward the asker. If I wasn't really interested in conversation with someone, I was a consultant. Vague enough, accurate, didn't lead to too many follow-up questions. If I found myself amid some debate where I wanted to be seen as an expert, I'd say I was a psychologist. This, too, was accurate, as I'd earned my Ph.D. in social psychology from Syracuse University a decade earlier. Here, the intended effect was to put the stranger in a more deferential position in the conversation, and more often than not, it worked. More recently, if I met a professional type who I thought might have the capacity to help further my career ambitions, I introduced myself as a coach. A business coach, executive coach, performance coach. This was my official title at Blackstone, but I just made it up. I never used the term life coach. This was despite the fact that I'd enrolled at Quantum Performance University, an online school that trained life coaches, after coming across some materials from the school's founder, Leonard Thompson. I found his perspective on the drivers of human behavior to be more insightful and practical than most anything I'd read in the esoteric journals of psychology. Without question, applying the skills I'd learned from these life coaching classes, with titles like Advanced Listening, Radical Empathy, and Soul Typing 101, they prove their worth in literal gold as my Blackstone team's overall numbers grew every quarter. Still, life coaching wasn't a field that I wanted to be associated with, despite its gaining traction in popular culture, or rather because of it. I saw too many online life coaching schools that seemed to pop up overnight like mushrooms in the dark, offering meaningless certifications to hordes of spiritual types who possessed a pulse and a credit card. At least that's how it looked to me, as someone who spent 4.5 years in the hardcore, peer-reviewed Ph.D. program, doing actual research, writing up an original thesis and dissertation, and having to defend it in front of a room of experts. Looking back, it's ironic that I defended my academic background. considering I didn't respect many of the people or processes in that arena very much. I suppose it was like hazing. I'd suffered through it, so for you to be legitimate, you needed to have suffered through it as well. So, even though more of my conversations at Blackstone grew more personal and life centered, I never self identified as a life coach and I bristled when labeled as such. Finally, if my intention was to impress someone, I'd introduce myself as an author. Again, this was true. An improbable book deal had landed in my lap because of some research I'd been involved with during graduate school. It had become a niche hit, selling several 100,000 copies and generating enough buzz that I began getting invitations for lucrative keynote speeches at various conferences and company retreats. The moment I'd laid eyes upon Jenna in the Vancouver train station, I wanted to impress her. So during our first exchange on the ride back to Seattle, I presented myself to her as an author. It worked. I tease her about it now. She could have asked any of the dozens of people milling about, waiting for the train. She could have looked up on the wall behind her and just read the big board. But instead, she'd extended an invitation to me in the form of a question. "Do you know the track number for Seattle?" I did. She thanked me, then moved on. I stole glances at her browsing the newsstand. She recognized me on board, took the seat across the aisle, and the conversation began. This was the Acela train, one of the most scenic in the country, as it hugs the Pacific coast for much of the ride. After chatting for the first hour of the trip, Jenna invited me to join her for dinner in the rear dining car, and I just about exploded out of my seat. We shared a booth, complete with white tablecloth, battery-powered candles, and red wine. We'd been a couple ever since. Back then, she lived in a condo in the Queen Anne section of the city, a sweet two-bedroom with a view of the Space Needle and Lake Union. She bought the lake house as soon as the money from Jason's lawsuit came in, and things were serious enough that she extended me another invitation. Of course, I had some misgivings about moving into her new place. What would her parents think? What would Jason's parents think? But I loved Jenna deeply, and I wanted to be with her. The lake house was built in the 80s and needed the usual updates, but it had an open layout with a modern feel and, as the saying goes, good bones. The location provided the best of both worlds, a relatively quiet house close to the city and on a beautiful lake with a view of Mount Rainier. If things didn't work out, somewhere in the back of our minds we both knew that I had my place to fall back on. So I rented out my small house in the city and started investing my own funds into making improvements around the lake house. Jenna never asked me to do this, but it quieted the voice inside me that said I needed to prove that I belonged here. The party unfolded just as I'd pictured. Any heaviness Jenna felt appeared to melt away at the sight of her friends, and the house was pleasantly loud with music, conversation, and laughter. The weather gave everything a celebratory air. After the gray winter, the sunny day in the mid-60s had everyone gravitating to the deck overlooking the water to soak in the warming rays. Just as I'd imagined, the mountain was out, meaning that the clouds that usually obscured Mount Rainier about 60 miles to the south had burned off, giving us a clear view of the Colossus sitting behind the southern end of Lake Issaquah, like a queen on her throne. I felt good that day, mingling with the couples, catching a nice beer buzz, making sure the younger children discovered the cooler of assorted fruity drink boxes and mini seltzers I'd set up for them. A pair of older girls asked if they could play the cornhole game I'd set up on the lawn next to the lake, and I escorted them to the boards. Standing on the lawn, I looked back up at the house, taking in the wide-angle view of the place from a distance. The house looked gorgeous, even better now that the deck was full of good people enjoying themselves. I snapped a couple of shots. I thought about sending one to my father, but returned the phone back in my pocket. That's when I saw Pritchard again, sitting on a cheap folding chair close to the water's edge, his body facing the sun, his eyes closed. The old bugger could use it, I thought. He looked pale during our encounter this morning, almost gray, and some vitamin D would do him good. The sight of him prompted me to inspect the pink welt on the meaty part of my palm, between my index finger and thumb. While the pain from the sting had faded, I noticed that my irritation with Pritchard had not. I didn't wish him ill. I just wished he was not my neighbor. I remembered something from one of the classes at Quantum Performance University. The concept was that whenever we find something irritating about another person, it's really a sign that that same energy is active within us. If it weren't, you wouldn't have a reaction. Something about this felt right to me, but my mind still poked at the idea, looking for holes. I looked closer at Pritchard, his head tilted back, his jaw slack. In fact, he looked so peaceful that he could be mistaken for dead. What had he said to me that bothered me so much? He called me a lucky son of a bitch, yes. But that wasn't it. I'd been called worse things. Rather, it was how he prefaced that remark that stuck in my craw. Most people have to work for a place like this, but not you. Ah, yes, that was it. Pritchard, of all people, hit me squarely in my emotional Achilles heel, the spot where my armor stretched thin. Looking back, I bought fully into the cultural conditioning that in order to have something you wanted, you needed to suffer for it. Nothing good could come with ease. There always had to be some sacrifice to show worthiness. Pritchard's jab made me think of my father, yelling one of his favorite mantras from the sidelines during my adolescent years. Hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. One time, I remember asking him if this meant he thought our team was less talented than our opponents, and he made the entire team run laps. In my psychology classes, I remember learning about the mere exposure effect. In short, the more people experience a stimulus, the more they start to prefer it. Like a song they don't like on first listen, but the more they hear the song over time, the more they start liking it. Our brains like shortcuts, so we tend to adopt the familiar. There was something similar going on within me regarding my sense of worth. At my core, I knew I was deserving of whatever I desired. However, I'd been exposed to so many messages that ran contrary to my knowing that there was no gain without pain, that this belief had taken root in my mind like an invasive species. As I looked back toward the fabulous home that I shared with my beautiful girlfriend, a reality better than anything I'd ever imagined for myself, I felt my spine contract as an icy shiver moved through me. Is all this too good to be true? Is it all just going to go poof and disappear when someone learns that I really don't deserve to be here, that I'm living above my means in a house paid for by my girlfriend? She's the one who endured the traumatic loss of her husband and then fought tirelessly in court for almost 2 years to earn this life. I'm the one who's shown up to drink the wine without ever having tended to the grapes. Those thoughts led me to brush up against the darkest one of all. Will she ever love me as much as she loves Jason? As the thoughts ricocheted in my mind, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Just seeing Damon's name displayed spiked my cortisol levels. My contract at Blackstone explicitly said no weekends, yet this seemed to be another boundary that Damon could not respect. I'd brought it up with him more than once to his face, and Damon's response was to offer a soft apology with a rationalization of why the transgression was necessary, and that he'd do it again. Check your email, urgent, the text said. Damon's texts were always blunt and directive. I read them as electronic grunts. No warmth, no awareness that the message would be taken in by a human being. I cursed myself for having read it because the weight of obligation took a heavy seat on my shoulders. Agreements aside, Damon never missed an opportunity to remind me how much he was paying me, and with my new contract in the midst of negotiations, I felt like he had me over a barrel. There were too many dollars at stake for me to risk over misdemeanors. I checked to make sure the girls were happy before walking back up to the house and entering through the sliding glass doors on the lower level that open up to my office area. I was surprised to find Rye, our friends Nick and Hannah's 5-year-old son, sitting alone at my computer. I can use this computer to play games? He asked rhetorically. I need the password. Before I could answer, I saw Nick descending the stairs. There you are, pal. what are you doing down here?" he asked his son. "I'm sure Alex doesn't want you in his office, bud. You need to get back upstairs or go outside and play." "There's only girls here, and they don't want to play with me," Rye protested. I assured Nick that it was fine and unlocked the computer for the boy. Nick said thanks and took measure of my workspace. Like most of the guests, this was his first visit to the house. "Jesus, you got $1 million view here, man," he said, gesturing to the wall of glass framing the lake and the mountain. "More like 1.6 million, and to be clear, it's really Jenna's view. I'm just the landscaper," I quipped, immediately wishing I just said thank you. But Nick responded with a warm laugh. I found him easy to like. We'd only hung out a couple times for concerts with the girls in the city, but he struck me as both interesting and interested, a rare combination. Nick grew up in a Pittsburgh suburb, worked as a barista at Starbucks in his early 20s, then kept getting promoted all the way to becoming a manager in the marketing department at the Seattle headquarters. We agreed we had similar origin stories, East Coasters rising from modest backgrounds, finding their way west to better situations. I first met Nick and Hannah over drinks before a show downtown at the Moore Theater. Jenna and I had been dating for a few months, and this was the first time I'd met any of her friends. I felt as though I were a newbie actor on a first audition. Knowing that Nick and Jason had been close friends added to my pressure. Jenna had shown me dozens of photos of the two couples sharing various adventures together, with the four of them looking young, happy, and vibrant. To my delight, Hannah and Nick put me at ease right away. They both presented as genuinely pleased to meet me and happy for their friend to be dating someone after so much grieving. Each of them made a point of asking me several questions about my life, and when invited like this, I could usually deploy my people skills in a way that made a positive impression. I like to think I knew how to tell a story, how to get a laugh, but most important, I tried to honor the magic power of asking people reciprocal questions and allowing their stories to be heard. After that night, I remember telling Jenna that I thought Nick and I could be good friends. We'd even exchanged numbers, but I'd taken no initiative in cultivating the relationship, despite Jenna's repeated encouragement. Sitting in my office now, Nick noticed the canvas blow-up of my book cover hanging on the wall. "Hey, I read your book, by the way," he said, pointing to the oversized cover. My book had carved out a Malcolm Gladwell-esque niche, crossing over from psychological research book into the business world. To date, Risk Bliss had sold almost 350,000 copies, and monthly sales continued to be remarkably steady a full 3 years after its release. To be honest, I picked it up to get a better sense of who you are after we first met, but I really liked it. I thought it was really well written, and the examples you used applied to a lot of us in the corporate world. I ordered 6 copies for my team, Nick said. Even though the success of Risk Bliss shifted the tectonic plates of my life, I still thought of the whole thing as a bit of a fluke, a wave I'd been lucky to catch. So my default response to compliments about it were usually to deflect and to change the subject. While so many strangers shared how my book made an impact upon their lives, after sending my father and brother hardcover editions when the book came out, neither of them had ever said a word to me indicating that they'd ever read it. In fact, I was pretty sure Jenna had never read the whole thing either. It was fine, of course. I could understand the book not interesting them. But just because it was fine didn't mean that I didn't notice. Maybe it was my 4th beer kicking in, or maybe it was the tone in his voice, but Nick's compliment landed easily within me, and I expressed my appreciation. We continued to share about our lives in ways that felt meaningful when Nick took it to the next level. "You know, Jason would have loved this place. He was a good dude, man. You would have liked him. Hell, everyone liked him. I mean, what happened was so fucked up," he said. "Daddy, language!" Rye yelled without looking up from his computer game. "Right, sorry bud, forgot you were there," he said, before lowering his voice and continuing as I slipped the noise-canceling headphones I use when writing onto Rye's head. "It's still hard to wrap my head around, even though I was right there next to him when he got stung, you know? I'll always be in awe of Jenna's strength through it all. She never stopped fighting for what she knew to be right. She deserves every bit of goodness that comes into her life, you and this place included," he said. I don't want to get too deep on you here, but Hannah and I are so happy for you and Jenna. You have such a beautiful home together, and from the outside looking in, it's clear that you turned her light back on. You should feel good about that," he continued. Nick then raised his beer bottle and extended it towards mine, and we clinked them. I appreciated Nick for not being polite and pretending the uncomfortable dynamic with Jason didn't exist. Talking about it relieved the pressure. Before I could express myself, Nick noticed a small black and white framed photo sitting on a bookshelf and walked over to it for a closer look. The photo was of me when I was 7 years old and my brother Tommy when he was 11. It showed me cocking my baseball bat behind a ball on a tee, my tongue curled at the corner of my mouth, preparing to hit. The snapshot captured both our faces, with Tommy towering behind me at the plate, lifting my back elbow to level his little brother's swing. It was the only picture I had of just me and Tommy, taken by my mother's friend Elizabeth, whose son played on my team. She had presented it to me years later, framed, when Tommy had been at his lowest point. When she handed it to me, she said, "Never forget who your brother really is, Alex." I would find her advice easy to remember, but hard to practice. "Are you the batter or are you the kid doing the coaching?" Nick asked. "I'm hitting, and that's my older brother Tommy, trying to help me. My father coached our Little League teams when we were kids. Tommy ended up being the best ball player in our area back home," I said. "You miss your family back east?" Nick continued. My family's pretty complicated, like every family, I suppose. A big reason that I moved out here was to put some distance between me and them. Healthy boundaries, as we say in the coaching business," I said, pointing to the photo now. Long story short, Tommy got hooked on opioids when he was in high school, and my family kind of unraveled after that. From about my freshman year of high school onward, my entire focus was to get out of our hick town and never look back. But to answer your question, I miss my mother. She tried to hold things together for a long time, but then she got sick and passed. My brother and father are still back home, but I don't talk to either of them as much as I should. I felt the twinge of guilt that arose when I thought of my family. I loved them all and sometimes wondered if I'd abandoned them by moving across the country, but living with miles between us felt better. "Oh, I hear you. My family back home is complicated too. The minute I got offered a job out here, I bolted," Nick offered. The mention of work reminded me of why I'd come to my office. I tapped Ryan on the shoulder to interrupt his game for a moment to find Damon's email. I could have checked it from my phone, but if I need to reply, I like to do it on my computer. Fewer mistakes, more professional. Scanning it, Damon vented about Desiree, one of his top earners whose performance numbers declined in each of the past 3 months. Damon tended to obsess, and Des had become his most recent point of focus. Of the nice financial analysts I coached at Blackstone, Des had become my secret favorite, as our conversations stretched beyond hitting her numbers and into her personal desires. I'd seen enough to get the gist of the message, murmuring to the screen, "I don't see why this couldn't wait until Monday," and internally chastising myself for falling into the trap of reading Damon's email when I knew better. "Work?" Nick asked, and I nodded. "Hey, the head honcho in my department in Starbucks called the front desk of our villa during our honeymoon in Costa Rica. Hannah was pissed, but sometimes work is work, right?" Before handing control back to Rye, I thought to save and close another open file. "Let me just save my book proposal, just in case, Rye," I said to the boy who just wanted to get back to his dinosaur game. "You're writing a new book? What's this one about?" Nick asked. "Well, Nick, that's a good question. My agent got me a solid deal for a follow-up to Risk Bliss. There's a good-sized check on the table, but first my publisher needs to see my proposal and greenlight it. To be honest, the writing process has been a bit of a slog compared to the first book, but the general theme will be similar, looking at current psychological research to find a sexy element that can be translated into creating success in the business world." "But aren't you already successful?" Rye chimed in now, headphones still on, his eyes not moving from the computer screen in front of him. We both turned toward the boy and laughed, surprised that he'd been following our conversation. "Yes, he is," Nick responded. Alex is very successful. Well, thanks, you two. Kind of you both to say, I said, noticing how the words felt good to hear. I moved the mouse to resume his game, but the boy was not done asking questions. So, are you a millionaire? Rye asked bluntly. Nick's eyes widened, and he opened his mouth to correct the boy, but I cut him off with a smile and a wave. I like your directness, Rye. It's a valuable skill for getting what you want in your life. Never lose that. And funny you should ask, because that's been a specific goal of mine for many years now. As for your question, the answer is currently no. I'm not a millionaire. Yet. But my plan is to join that club soon, I said. Nick shook his head. I have no idea where he gets this stuff. Hannah and I never talk money around him. The beers had loosened my tongue as they do, and I felt good to share some of my inner world with Nick. At the risk of sounding like an asshole talking about money, language, Rye interjected, now clicking the mouse to kill the colorful beasts on my iMac screen. I apologized to my new little friend and hesitated to continue before Nick assured me he wanted to hear more. Well, I've been focused on being a millionaire since I was in high school, and if a couple things like this new book deal fall into place by the end of the year, I said. I didn't break down the numbers with Nick, but the math added up. I'd done the simple calculations in my head 100 times in the past month alone. Given the success of Risk Bliss, and with the strong proposal for a second book, my agent was shooting for a $250,000 advance. In addition, I expected to renew my yearly retainer agreement with Damon in the upcoming weeks for around that same amount. Add in my cash, portfolio, and the rising value of my bungalow, and I'd be there. At least on paper, as the saying goes. That's awesome, Alex. You had this goal since high school? The only goal I remember from high school was finding the next keg party in the woods. Man, no wonder you became a coach with that kind of focus. The closer my vision felt to reality, the more I'd been reflecting on how the idea got stuck in my head. I could pinpoint the exact moment the seed was sown decades earlier, and I shared the story with Nick. During my junior year in high school, I'd become eligible for induction into the National Honor Society. However, even though I was one of the top 3 students in my class, the invitation never came while lesser students got the nod. I never cared much about the honor until the moment they deemed me unworthy of it. I went to the office of the faculty advisor in charge, the school librarian, Mr. Winslow, and asked for clarification. He spoke in circles with no conviction, shifting in his seat, and his discomfort at my presence made me feel powerful. When I asked him why I had been passed over, he tripped over his words, saying something about a, quote, morals clause. Inductees had to have the academic chops, but they were expected to be upstanding members of the community as well, he'd said. Of course, I pushed back, asking for a specific example of where my behavior would disqualify me, but the answer came to me before Mr. Winslow spoke again. As I shared the old story with Nick, I felt the pilot light of old resentments find enough gas to take flame. I even mimicked the high-pitched, shaky tone I had heard in Mr. Winslow's voice that day, a man who knew in his heart that he was wrong, but who lacked the courage to change course. Alex, you have to realize that the situation with your brother is a delicate one. I'd spent a lot of my high school years having to deal with the consequences of my brother's actions, and the fact that this jerk-off was using something that I had no control over to deny me what I'd earned, well, that was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. So I rose out of my chair. I was like 6'1", $170 back then. And this guy's a very soft 5'7" tops, and I stuck my finger 2 inches from his chest and I said, fuck you and your fucking club. I don't need it and I don't need you. When I get out of this place, I'm going to become a millionaire, so for the rest of my life, I never have to put my fate in the hands of some polyester dipshit like you. Saying the words, I felt the adrenaline flow just as it had the day so many years earlier. I thought to apologize for my language, but Rye's attention was fully immersed in the video game now. Man, that's wild how one incident in high school put such a fire in your belly, Nick said. Do you ever think about how his not letting you into the Honor Society was a good thing? It took me a beat to consider his question. I expected him to ask about Mr. Winslow's issue with my family, as most people did when I told the story, but he did not. Honestly, no, but I see what you're getting at. Anytime I think about Mr. Winslow, it still brings up all this latent anger. I still wouldn't mind punching the guy's lights out. Nick nodded and then extended his right arm, beer in hand, toward the view of the lake. Oh, I get it, man. But look at where you are right now. Maybe that guy wasn't the devil after all. Maybe that dude was the exact person you needed to focus you that led you here, to being on the cusp of reaching your millionaire dream. You know what I mean? Anyway, I've been trying to see more of my life through this lens. I know it can sound like a stretch. I nodded and drained the last swallow of my beer. I'd come across this line of thinking from a mentor at Quantum Performance University who'd encourage us to play with the idea that the universe is always conspiring to help you. I noticed I liked the sentiment, but it wasn't a belief I could get fully behind in my mind. My years in academia trained me to trust the research and the data over fuzzy ethereal concepts, no matter how warm they felt. Yet, standing with Nick, I entertained the thought for a beat. Did I owe the librarian a sliver of appreciation? Did his rejection stiffen my resolve and set me on a course to prove people like him wrong? It felt like a stretch, considering all the risks I'd taken to get to this place, but I couldn't dismiss the idea entirely. Maybe I was willing to take the leaps I did because I wanted to prove the Winslows in my life wrong. Before I could ponder any more, Nick continued, wearing an impish smile as his bright green eyes lit up. Hell, Alex, you should send that dude a copy of your book and a thank you letter for what he did for you. I have a better idea, I countered with a laugh. You write the letter, and I'll sell you all the books you want to mail him. I needed to refresh my beer and rejoin the party upstairs, so I told Nick that Rye was free to use the computer for as long as he wanted. As I ascended the stairs, I continued to entertain the absurd thought of writing Mr. Winslow, when my mind connected to a parallel thought from earlier in the day. As I reached the top of the stairs, I replayed another snippet of my encounter with Pritchard this morning that reminded me of Nick's suggestion. You should be kissing that little bee's ass, he'd said.